Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. Good to see you in this place. I was not ambassador in Berlin. You will get more information about the space itself by the two ladies who will do the sightseeing with you. But I have some guilt in this concept here. When I was in charge of the Swedish promotion. In the late 1990s, we had a committee set up for this fantastic new concept of having a common Nordic embassy. This was a chance which is very seldom given in diplomacy, and it was because of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Because on 9 November 1989, that made it possible for the two Germanys to unite on the 3rd of October 1990. So from then on, it's a new situation. The embassies which used to be in Bonn for West Germany and in East Berlin for East Germany, there was rather soon a decision by the joint parliament, Bundestag, that the capital should move back to Berlin, which then happened later in the 90s. And this fantastic Nordic concept was open in the autumn of 1999. But you will hear more about that, about the architects, about the geography, etc. There's one thing which you might have, if you are good at the north and south, east and west and so on, you might have seen already out here that the Finnish embassy, the part of the Nordic embassy which is Finnish is east, and the part of the Nordic embassy which is Iceland is west. And then the other three are some also according to geographical position. So that is this unique concept which you don't very often have the chance to materialize. And my impression is that they are working very well together. And it is another confirmation of the strong tradition of Nordic cooperation. Now, first of all, I have written Scandinavia up there on this map here because in general it is quicker to say Scandinavia than to say Nordic countries. But it's semantically not completely correct, because Scandinavia goes back to the old Romans 2,000 years ago, when they looked, if they were so exotic that they were prepared to go up north. They found something which was the very south of Sweden, and they called that Skåne, and we still call it Skåne. And I hear one of the ladies here, it seems to me to be both of you, so even, yeah. From that point of view, the concept of Scandinavia came up. And Scandinavia, to be exact, is only Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So if you look, for instance, at the flight business, you will find that there is one Scandinavian Airlines, and this consists only of these three countries. Finland has its own air company, Finnair, and Iceland also has its own air company. But when we speak, let's say, in the United Nations and so on, nobody minds if we call the whole group of 5 countries and their different islands for Scandinavia. It's okay with us Swedes, with the Finns, with the Danes, with the Norwegians, with the Icelanders. So, but we might rather speak today, we might rather speak about the Nordic countries. You see in the map also, without these the specific colors of the Nordic, you see also Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania just across the Baltic Sea. And as a matter of fact, for historic reasons and for political reasons, economic reasons, even social and personal reasons, there is a special link between the Nordic countries and the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So they are almost the kind of honorary members of the Nordic group in many connections, and we have very close relations. What is common with all these Nordic countries is, of course, that the population density is relatively low. So we have more than 10 million inhabitants in Sweden, but we have only 5 million in Finland, 5 million in Norway, and 5 million in Denmark. And Iceland is only some 300,000 inhabitants. So, and if you go to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, also Estonia is 2 million, Latvia 2 million, Lithuania 3 million. So it is, from a population point of view, not a very powerful part of the world, but from an economic, technical, political, and human rights and so on, I will come back to that point of view, it is a very strong factor in international politics, economy, and cultural diplomacy. So we can speak about the Nordic countries plus a certain extension, because they participate in meetings of Nordic countries and so on. Now, to what extent are the languages a common issue for us? Well, it depends almost which generation you ask. Unfortunately, I would say. If you ask my generation, and I'm not 20, you will find that we understand Norwegian very well as a Swede. We understand Danish rather well, and in written without any problem. Nobody of the other Nordic countries will understand Finnish, because Finnish is a completely different language with Central Asian origin. Interestingly enough, they are kind of cousins, linguistically cousins with Estonia, and also with Hungary, further down in Central Europe. But in Finland, you will find a 4 to 5% minority speaking Swedish. And that has historical reasons. I'll come back to that. And then you have, out there in the Atlantic, you have Iceland. And most people know, Nordic people know, that if you wish to understand or to learn more or less how the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Danes spoke 1,000 years ago, you go to Iceland, because you have had a kind of a Nordic conservation, Nordic language conservation up there. So you find expressions that our ancestors used to speak long time ago. But in the meantime, both the Danes, the Swedes, and the Norwegians have been very much influenced, particularly by Germany, by the German language, but also later on to some extent by the French language, even Latin, and so on. So that is the difference between these three languages and the Icelandic, which is a clear Nordic, old Nordic language. The history is important to know, to understand a little bit of the Nordic countries. Well, we all know about the Vikings. And the Vikings, they were sailing mainly from the Norwegian west coast, from the Swedish west coast, you know, they're from Gothenburg and down, and from the Danish west coast. They were sailing westward. And they were, well, you know, they have a reputation of being rather wild. Some would say they were there only for trade business or trading business. But of course, some brutality was taking place also. So they went to to the British Islands. They went also to Normandy. And why is Normandy Normandy? Well, of course, because people had come from the north once. So there was this connection as well. If you go to in northern England, to Yorkshire and that area, you will find a lot of traces from the Vikings. They came there in the early 9th century, and a difference from many other parts of the world where the Vikings went is that they stayed on here for almost 200 years. You still see a lot of traces from the Vikings up in northern England. Not Scotland, but northern England. So that was the West Vikings. But then we also had Vikings going eastwards. And they would go then over to Estonia or even to Russia, to the area of Ladoga. And then they would go down either Volga or some of the, or also through Ukraine to Dnieper and these rivers. And they went all the way down to today's Istanbul, to Constantinople, as we called it then. And there you still can say also some individual traces from the Vikings at the time. And they were mainly Swedish Vikings from the east coast of Sweden. And you may also know that the early part of the Russian Empire involved a lot of battles and fights and competitions with the Swedes, with this kind of political and military meetings, to put it mildly, took place all the way up to the Second World War, as a matter of fact. So this is the history of Vikings, and from then on, what they had in common was in the, let's say, 600-700 years ago, also the union. You see on German cars, if they come from Hamburg, from Lübeck, from Bremen, or from other places in the northern Germany, you will find Hamburg does not have a simple H, which you would have believed. H is Hannover. They have HH, Hansestadt Hamburg, because there was a trade union, not a trade union, sorry, a trade organization called Hansa. And that involved northern Germany. It even involved, to some extent, parts of Netherlands and Denmark, of course, Sweden, also parts of the Baltic states and Finland. So there were already in very old times, there were these efforts to cooperate in trading. But the history went on, and there was one development which was very clear, more or less up till the last century, that there were a competition between particularly two powers in Northern Europe. And then one was Denmark, and the other one was Sweden. There was a rivalry going on. There were some wars fought, and there were also kind of colonies on various sides of the sea, and that was both Finland and Norway were playing there rather a secondary role in history at that time. The biggest country from a geographical point of view is, as a matter of fact, Denmark. Because if you go up the top of the map there, you have Greenland, which is a huge piece of land. Not very populated, but a huge piece of land. On top of this, you also have the Faroe Islands, which you find there between Iceland and the British Islands. also being part of Denmark. And to look further on the Danish Empire, so to say, Norway for a very long time belonged to, well, it was part of the Danish monarchy, the Danish kingdom. That ended in 1814 when Norway became part of a Swedish-Norwegian union, which lasted until 1905. And since 1905, Norway is an independent state. Denmark is an independent state with the present borders. More or less, they had some war with Prussia and Germany in the 1860s and so, which had some influence on the southern border. But more or less, the Denmark has its same geography, and Sweden too. Sweden had, as a great power, was expanding rather east and south. You heard about the 30-year War, which was in the 17th century, 1618 till 1648. And one of the winners of that war, you could say, was Sweden. It was a terrible war, and there's still a strong German tradition, for instance, to you know, almost try to frighten people, even their kids, about the Swedes might come tomorrow. So that was, they were looting a lot around Europe, and many big Swedish castles are filled with antiquities and beautiful things that they found there during these wars. But the most important thing is perhaps the fact that already in the 12th century, Finland became part of Sweden. So that went on until 1809, as a matter of fact. And this is also the reason why there's still a minority of Finns who speak Swedish. And it's the reason why Finland is a bilingual country. The Swedish language has a rather tough situation, I would say, now. It is less and less spoken in the schools or in the street. If you go to Helsinki and try to speak Swedish with a person who is less than 30 years old, he or she will immediately guide you into English language as their common language. That is the reason. As a matter of fact, both Estonia and Latvia were also part of the Swedish Empire for a few hundred years then in the 17th, 18th centuries. And northern Germany as well. You know, Rügen, Usedom, these parts up in north of at the Baltic Sea were for some time. Oh, sorry, what's happened here? For some time. Part of the Swedish Empire. So the histories explain a lot of the present situation. I mentioned the fact that to what extent we understand each other's languages is a generation question. I just mentioned why this is the case as far as Finland is concerned, but it does not explain why today when a Swedish television reporter goes to Norway and speaks to a Norwegian politician who speaks perfect, clear, good, understandable Norwegian, that the television and so would put subtitles to the language of this Norwegian minister. And this is because, and I know, my daughter hardly understands Norwegian, and Danish not at all. So it is a generation question. A little bit unfortunate, I would say, because it is a feeling, you know, particularly if you have a Nordic group, some Finns, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, Icelanders sitting together and they can communicate in a common Nordic language. We would call that language, we used to call it Scandinavian language, where we do some concessions about this house is a typical example of this. In Swedish, we would call this house the gemensamma huset. But in Norwegian and Danish, it's called felles. Felles means common. So that is one of these concessions that the Scandinavian language used to do. When we had informal meetings between Scandinavian or Nordic ambassadors, we could communicate on our own languages, more or less. But today, I think it's in the last 20 years, today, when the Nordic diplomats meet somewhere, they probably are communicating with each other in English. So we are losing one dimension of this common Nordic feeling, you might say. Now, but this common Nordic feeling became it has had ups and downs. There was a kind of Scandinavianism in the 19th century where people were thinking, well, why don't we kind of create a great Nordic empire together? But that fell down, that was never really taken seriously. But after the Second World War, which was very complicated from a strategic political point of view, because both Norway and Denmark were invaded by Hitler in April 1940, and through the war they were occupied by the Nazis. Finland, on the other hand, at the beginning of the war, had a fight about eastern Finland, Karelia, against Soviet Union, Stalin. And they kind of lost that so-called Winter War, but wanted to take a revenge later on. But by that time, Stalin had become the main enemy of Hitler. So when Finland wanted to have some sort of support in its second fight against Soviet Union, they got the support from the Nazis, which of course complicated the situation. And in the middle you had Sweden being neutral. Usually I say Sweden was neutral with a quotation mark, because it was a kind of a pragmatic neutralism. It became necessary in order to avoid a Nazi invasion to allow the Germans to have troop transportations through Sweden up to northern Norway when Norway was occupied by the Nazis. And it became also necessary to supply the German war machine with iron ore. So, but the pragmatism comes then when things starting to go bad for the Germans. End 1942. The Swedish government immediately sent its two top diplomats to London to negotiate iron ore deliveries to the Allies. Yeah, that is pragmatic neutrality. Not very heroic, but it certainly saved Sweden from the Second World War. All this made, of course, the war ended, and there were some bad feelings about neighbors. Sweden's neutrality could be considered by some neighbors as a treason, more or less. And there was Finland, and on one hand, and Norway on the other hand, had been on different sides of the war. You know, so a lot of such things. But really, now comes heroic into the picture. Heroic measures were taken immediately after war to really start to create this common Nordic feeling. And there were some very ambitious projects. There was one project about establishing an economic union, and there was another about a defense union. But at that time, or to be exact, since 1948, Finland's hands were bound by a treaty with Soviet Union, because Finland had lost, Soviet Union had won. And the Soviets, or Stalin, said that he would not allow Finland to have any too close cooperation with other parts. There should be a special relationship, a special friendship between Finland and Soviet Union. So that was a kind of lacking independence of Finland, which lasted until 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. And in international politics, we were speaking about Finlandization of a country. And you could say, for instance, today's situation, with the Russian invasion in Ukraine and so on, you could say Ukraine could, whatever happens in the war, if they are unlucky, the end result would be a kind of Finlandization. Again, independence, but still dependent on the big neighbor. So these were the problems, but the success, after all, was the creation, first of all, of a passport union. So how long? 46 years before Schengen Agreement in Europe, we had the Nordic Passport Union, 1952, which meant it was self-evident you could move across all Nordic borders without any passport. And this, of course, was important for this common Nordic feeling. In the same year, in 1952, the Nordic Council was created. And the Nordic Council is both a political organ. There are ministers and parliamentarians from all the Nordic countries, including even Greenland and Faroe and Åland, which is the little island between Stockholm and Helsinki. So all these political aspects are there, although I have to admit that they are a little bit weaker today than they used to be, because there are other priorities. Let's say there is the European Union, and there is also, of course, NATO, I will come to that, and United Nations. But it is still a political priority, and speaking about culture diplomacy, it is an important platform for culture diplomacy, intra-Nordic and also to some extent outward. There is an annual music prize for best Nordic musician. There is a literary prize with a very special jury, very ambitious, for the best author. There is a film prize. And there is a lot of things happening in culture and arts among the Nordic countries. There is, of course, something even more deeper into these common Nordic cultural efforts. We do share values. We share the values of democracy, human rights, all the freedoms, and we could say that we have been living up to the expectations of these kind of values in the last 70 years or so. So that is a very good ground, platform for taking part internationally in the big negotiations. I have had the pleasure of spending many years as a Swedish representative in various United Nations organs, in Geneva, in Rome, in New York, Nairobi, etc. And always, if you wish to create a point, create a resolution for an important matter in human rights, in development assistance, peace, or whatever. The normal start for any Swedish or Norwegian diplomat is the Nordic group. The next step is, of course, the European Union, but the guarantee that you have, that you stand on the same value basis you have really among the Nordic countries. So that is the basis, you could say, also of Nordic cultural diplomacy, and also of Nordic common politics. So the performance of Nordic countries have, because of that, because of these common values, you could say, have been historically much bigger and more important than our population numbers would normally allow. We have become a voice in the international community which has been listened to. So, but there are of course also differences for historical reasons, for geographical reasons, and so on. We have the question of the European Union, for instance. The big European project started with the coal and steel union, early 50s, was kind of settled really with the Rome treatment in 1957. And from the 1960s on, it became an issue whether for the Nordic countries to be part of this European cooperation or not. The first country to join, after a referendum, was Denmark in 1973. At that time, it was still only the European communities. And as you know, the European Union became a union in 1992. And by then, by 92, Soviet Union was gone, the Berlin Wall was gone, the new united Germany was there, and all this meant that it was possible for two previously neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, to join the European Union. We immediately handed over our application, and the whole procedures took part, and by 1st of January 1995, Sweden and Finland joined the European Union. So why not Norway, and why not Iceland? Well, Norway, they had one referendum in the 70s and one also in the 90s in the context when Sweden and Finland, and for that sake also neutral Austria, joined the European Union. But in both referenda, the Norwegians, with a rather significant majority, decided not to enter. What could be the reason? Well, it could have been simply the fact that from the 1960s on, Norway was an oil power. They had this fantastic natural resource, which all of a sudden gave the Norwegian balance of payment an enormous strength. They could build up their funds. They could feel really, really safe that in whatever international crisis they had this financial capacity. So that might be one reason. Another reason is you look at the map again and take note of the fact that in spite of the tendency which we have all over the world, that population is concentrating to the capital, which we have in Sweden, which we have in many other countries and so on. In spite of that, Norway has the ambition to have a living economy, society, healthcare, school system, etc., even up in the most extreme north part, up at the Barents Sea. And you would call this national regional policy. And the very ambitious Norwegian regional policy might not be completely, shall we say, commensurable with the EU standards. And that is what the fear of the Norwegians, that if we really wish to have our idea of a living Norway from the north down to the south, we might perhaps better do it ourselves, but then at the same time have as good as possible relations with the European Union as possible. So today, ironically, for instance, the poor Brits are discussing perhaps we should at least try to have the same kind of relations with the European Union as the Norwegians have, and the Swiss for that sake. Because, you know, they had a rather bad deal. At least we see that in these days with the complete chaos which is now dominating London politics. So Norway has a good deal. They have all the advantages. The only thing they don't have is the decision making procedure. They are not participating in that, but they have all the advantages, the other, including the internal market. So these are the difference. And Iceland, well, I think it's simply geography. A few years ago, there was a quick move from Reykjavik that they wanted to join, but then after some economic crisis, they said, no, we don't, we wait. And there, normally all politics about Iceland spells with a big F. It spells fish. So it has to do, that has an impact on politics, has an impact on economy, has an impact on the geopolitical matters and so on. I might even say it has an impact on culture. So anyway, that might be the main reason. You know, EU has a certain competence in these areas right now. We are rather upset in eastern Sweden that the EU is not putting a stronger limitation to the fishing in the Baltic Sea, because our lovely strömming is disappearing. So the Icelanders, they have a completely different situation, as you will understand, given the geographical position. Now, NATO, and this was the big difference until that 24th of February 2022. The big differences between the Nordic countries. We had Denmark and Norway almost automatically being founding members of NATO in 1949. That was natural because they belonged to the Allies. And the same thing for Iceland. Sweden as neutral and Finland as neutral with a Russian quotation mark were not in a position or decided not to join NATO. And this has been the case, supported by at least 60% of the Swedish population until the 24th of February 2022. I belonged also to that majority, by the way, but on the morning of the 25th, I and most of the Swedes said, well, we'd better join NATO, because this guy Putin over there is completely unpredictable. And the usual argument which we used to have to say that neutral Sweden and Finland in Northern Europe would contribute to stability in that region. It isn't there anymore. We have the situation, the geopolitical situation in Europe, and by the way also in the world, changed with the Russian invasion. So now Sweden and Finland are in the process of becoming members of NATO, and will be, I'm sure, next year, unless a certain Mr. Erdogan down in Ankara will try to prevent that. He uses a lot of arguments. His favorite arguments is, of course, his favorite enemies, the Kurds. And when he says that Sweden has have too many Kurds, and they are, of course, all by definition terrorists. Sweden is a very questionable new member of NATO. But I take it that Mr. Stoltenberg, who by the way, who NATO chef, who is by the way is Norwegian, will visit Erdogan one of these days, and hopefully can convince him in a more positive direction. But it might take some time. So when by next year, the whole Baltic Sea area and the whole Nordic area, including the extension partners, so to say, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, will be members of NATO. Another thing which is a very strong Nordic, well, is a real Nordic strength, is a kind of a Nordic brand. It is, if you look at various lists of best international development assistance, best in human rights, best in applying democracy, best in the freedoms of press, media, etc., etc., best in gender equality, and so on, you will find for sure always the Nordic countries somewhere in the top. Among the best 10, you will find the 5 Nordic countries. And this, of course, is a wonderful thing for us who have been representing any Nordic countries through the time. It's partly, it's a combination, I guess, of strength, skill and luck, and also a kind of a tradition of wishing freedom. So that is perhaps the strongest, the brand of Finland, of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, all brands are very strong. We have, of course, different individual. The Finns, they have the sauna and the ice hockey team and fantastic architects and design and so on. The Swedes have the Nobel Prize and ABBA and a lot of other good arguments. The Danes have the Lille Havsfru in the port, and they have their beer, Carlsberg and Tuborg, of course. And they nowadays have a very good football team as well, with good chances down in Qatar. The Norwegians, they have Edvard Grieg and Henrik Ibsen, the great playwright, and they have a fantastic winter sport, particularly ski runners and so on. The Icelanders, they have Björk, and they are the most reading country in the world, they say. So they say 70%, 30% of the Icelanders are big authors, and the rest of them are the biggest readers. So there's some very strong arguments from a brand point of view, from a strong cultural point of view. Finland usually wins the contest, the kind of the investigation on the level of school education, the so-called PISA study, which comes out annually or every second year. Finland is on the top there. Sweden, unfortunately, has some problems there, similar to the German problems, as a matter of fact. But generally speaking, education has a strong place, and science too. So we have very different cultural diplomacy policy, if you mean the institutions. Finland is here the most active. They have 13 or 15, depending on definition, various cultural institutes. They have one excellent here in Berlin, for instance, worth visiting. And so they have an active, ongoing promotion in some key countries around the world. Sweden does not have that. Sweden is working like this through the embassy. You always have a cultural attaché or cultural counselor doing that. Sweden has only one cultural institute, and that is in Paris. Norway and Denmark do not work with this kind of cultural institutes, and neither does Iceland. So there are different ways of solving these problems, but the good news is that any embassy, any cultural attaché from a Nordic country has automatically a good start, simply for all these arguments that I have mentioned, that we know the people in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America, they know that the Nordics are good guys, basically speaking. So now the new situation with the Russian invasion and the new geopolitical situation, as I said, means probably that all countries up here in the north will be NATO members. It means a stronger emphasis on defense. Everybody should have up to 2% of their BNI in defense expenditure. And it means also an orientation more towards defending democracy than just generally supporting peace. And this means we are just in a period now when we have to change our minds. This mind changing is going on right now. It is not enough just to say we are in favor of peace. You have to somehow define it and say what values are the most important ones. So we will see. We are in the beginning of this process. Hopefully we are approaching the end of the war. Who knows? But even after the war, there will be a lot of continued rethinking. And on top of this, we have, of course, the climate issue becoming more urgent by the day. And here again, you will find the Nordic countries on the top. It was no coincidence that it was a Norwegian lady who introduced the concept sustainable development. In the report, Our Common Future, a report by an international committee led by the Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland, a report to the United Nations. This keyword, sustainable development, was introduced. You won't find it in a Oxford lexicon or anything like that in the 1970s or the 80s. But from then on, it's the keyword in all climate efforts in the world. And all the Nordic countries have a very strong ambition in environmental issues and climate issues, and has also been able to have some success. Now, many of you will ask yourself now, will all this change with a new Swedish government here? The right parties won the election, and some people speak about, or they even themselves speak about, a paradigm shift. Well, you will allow an old diplomat to say that governments change, but a certain orientation which goes deeper than the government will continue. I don't see a radical change in Swedish policy, because if you compare, the reason why people are upset about this is, of course, that there is a party, the Sweden Democrats, which now has a strong influence. They are not in the government, but have a strong influence. But you know, Norway had the same story some 10 years ago. They also had the Fremskrittspartiet, the Progress Party, also a right-wing party, also skeptical about immigrants. They had been part of the government. The Finns had the same story some years ago, and the Danes have had it up till now also. So there is this movement of a right-wing party is also a Nordic phenomenon. It's different in the various Nordic countries, but the common thing is that and that is perhaps an optimistic statement by me, but I feel that if they are given some responsibility, some of their most radical ideas might disappear. That was the case in Norway, that was the case in Finland. And now, by the way, the most important aspect for the new government was the immigration policy. And of course, the other day, the outgoing Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson, said, well, she is in principle is in agreement on the immigration policy, that something has to be done. That is, so which means that it does not seem so radical as it might seem. And by the way, Sweden has by far had the biggest number of immigrants in Europe in terms of immigrants per 1,000 inhabitants. 1.8 million people came to Sweden since year 2000. And that is rather much for a country which used to be 9 million, now it's 10 million, 10.3 or 10.4 million. So this is, and why is it so much? If we go to Uganda, for instance, which is a much bigger immigration country than Sweden is, you will see that they take 3 million or 4 million and so on. But what is the policy there? Well, they say that part of eastern Uganda is free. You can put up your tent there. And then just sit down and wait and try to, perhaps you can find something on the ground, perhaps you meet some animal, and you can, otherwise you can simply wait for the international organizations to come and help you. That is, with all respect, I am not demanding that Uganda should do anything more, but anyway, that is their policy. In Sweden or Germany, each person who is on the ground of Germany or Sweden, right, has the right to enjoy somehow shelter, school, healthcare, and in best cases even a job. And this high ambitions, which has to do with the old welfare society, this high ambition makes every new person a big, let's say, bureaucratic challenge. And evidently that became a little bit too much for many Swedish authorities, because their hearts are open, and we love to see people who are trying to get away from a bad situation. But the capacity with a very high ambition of welfare for each person is very difficult to reach. And that the Germans have faced, but the Swedes even more in percentage. So we'll see what happens. They have only 1 week behind us at the new government. They will, the bigger difference will certainly not be for internal reasons, for domestic reasons, but rather for the reasons that I just mentioned, the new geopolitical situation and the new energy situation, the inflation, and all these issues are, so it's rather defending the status quo, which is will be the main task, rather than doing the big paradigm shift, if you ask me. The future role of Nordic countries will certainly be strong, I believe, because we have a goodwill. The question is, could the Nordic countries in cultural diplomacy be stronger and take initiatives? There is perhaps something which we have been missing in recent years, because it's a difficult balance. How shall we behave in relation to Russia, a neighbor which is authoritarian and which invades another neighbor? How shall we behave in relation to China, another authoritarian state, which is a fantastic market for our industry and technology, etc., but which does not respect normal human rights? So all these things, can we, through cultural diplomacy, build bridges with these authoritarian states? Or shall we allow a world to come up where we simply have a new wall, a new complete iron curtain to two big and very population strong countries in the world, to China and Russia? I don't believe we can do that. I think somehow we have to find means, and cultural diplomacy should be one of the means here, one of the instruments, and the Nordic countries should play a role here. That is my message at the end. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karl-Erik. I just learned something new about Sweden that I didn't know before. We thought the Germans were very exact when it comes to punctuality. The Swedes even more so. So I was told we can go on with questions, not a problem. However, the tour will end at 12, no matter what. So the woman is waiting outside. So what I would suggest, since I think it is good to at least have a brief tour, that we do that. I know you have a little time pressure today, but would you be available? Are you coming on a tour with us, or? Because I'm just thinking, because it'd be great to give the students a chance for questions.
I can be around here till 12 o'clock.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then maybe during the tour we can also approach Karl-Erik for questions. It's up to you, or we take a few questions here first. But you said no matter what, the tour will end at 12.
You can mention that the tour will be provided by former students.
Okay, excellent. So a former student will be accompanying us and leading us for the tour. Excellent. But I don't know, would there be one or two questions? I don't want to kill the discussion. Maybe one or two questions and then we go to the tour? Yeah? If everyone could be quiet for a second.
Yeah. Shh.
Have to work together or people freeze to death.
Yeah, that's that's a good question. We, generally speaking, we used to speak about mentalities in Northern Europe and mentalities in Southern Europe, and we might add, in a global perspective, mentalities in Africa or in China and so on. I don't think I could find a direct connection here. We do find it, we speak sometimes about the vodka belt, and that is the part of the world, including Russia, the whole Nordic countries, plus Scotland and Canada, where we used to like strong liquors. But if you look at the statistics, for instance, the Nordic countries, perhaps even the Scotch, are becoming wine drinkers. And drinking less whiskey or vodka or strong liquor. Now I think it's more the kind of historic reasons that I mentioned before. I think that makes us rather good at multilateral. Perhaps, one thing, perhaps our relatively small populations, we have to keep together, and we always know that we cannot we cannot save the world alone. We cannot even save our own interests alone. So that's why the Nordic countries, as I indirectly mentioned before, have from the very beginning been very strong supporters of the United Nations and the United Nations idea. And there's no coincidence that the first Secretary General of the United Nations was a Norwegian, Trygve Lie, and the second one was a Swede, Dag Hammarskjöld. So that is, I think that is, we tend to lean towards multilateral politics because that makes it more possible to improve the world.
There's two hands, so the final two questions. Ladies first, and then we'll come to you, and I'll make sure the tour guide doesn't go. Please.
Good morning, sir. I got interested in what you said about sustainable development, and the question I want to ask is, for someone who comes from a country like myself, Cameroon, where we're in the third world, we're still struggling to develop. What is going to be your assessment of the level of sustainable development, or what do you think we're making progress, or what recommendations would you make?
Well, this is a 2-hour lecture. I have it on a USB. But to make it very short, the challenges are enormous, and it's interesting. 50 years ago, the first environmental conference, UN environmental conference, took place in Stockholm. Also, no coincidence. And the differences you found there were the richer countries saying we have to do something, we have to improve the environment, we have to do a lot of measures in order to improve the environment. And the developing countries, including those from Africa and Asia, would say, wait a minute, you can say that because you are already developed. Before we can do that, we have to go through this industrialization phase that you have gone through. So how we will solve that? That was the question. And you now go to Paris conferences and similar conferences today about the climate, and you will find exactly the same arguments, with one big difference, an important difference, and that is that China and India has now joined the richer part of the arguments, because they have such a strong part of their economy which is developed, industrialized, high technology, etc., etc. So they are also seeing these and also seeing the possibilities to have a reasonable environmental and climate policy themselves. But as for Africa is concerned, as you know, there's such a big difference between the big cities and the countryside. That is still an enormous challenge, and the desertification of Sahel, for instance, and all the challenges are enormous, and it is an international responsibility.
Okay, the final last question or comments? And a brief response, please. Yes.
Yeah, I think part of my question has already been answered.
Okay.
Through the question my sister gave, but the comment I want to give is this. Most often, if you check the statistics of those who are in this hall, I don't believe that 10% of them have visited Africa. And the first impression they have about Africa is always negative. It's always negative.
Not necessarily. Okay.
So it's as if the Africa is there, cap in hand, begging from the rich nation. But we want fairness. We want fairness. When you are dealing with Africa in trade, there should be fairness. Whatever we are doing, we are all human beings, and we should look at it from that point of view. I don't want to go further. I'm being emotional. I just hope I don't want to believe that Africa goes and cap in hand begging, because this is where the natural resources reside.
Oh.
And we know what is happening in the world. We are no longer these jungle, people living on the trees. We are educated, and we know what is happening in the world. So we want to believe that treat us like human beings and be fair with us in our dealings. Give us the technology that we need to develop our countries. We have the natural resources. Do not impose certain things on us on economic ground, IMF, World Bank, and all these things that are going on. Please ask, I ask a question. Why do you think that the African countries rush to Russia, China, for them to develop their trains and this and that? It's because it's a little bit a fair dealing. It does not put us on perpetual loan, whatever that our generations and generations of our children would not be able to pay back. Thank you.
You have a point here which is very, very strong indeed. As I said, I was very much in international negotiations, and I get almost nostalgic about an organization which nobody of you know about probably, UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And this was a very, unfortunately, unsuccessful organization. But they had the ambition to try, through negotiations, to somehow improve or to change the inequalities, the natural resources, the use of that, the rights of nations to have the access and the benefit of their natural resources. All this was on the agenda, but you can guess which countries more or less, well, they postponed it and postponed it and postponed it, and in the early 1980s, UNCTAD more or less died. And this was, well, we can say a lot of positive things about globalization, but this is the negative one, because globalization gave the power and the main influence to the richest enterprises and to some extent governments in the world. And there has been an enormous development for them. And for some, let's say, big cities, capitals, and so on in Africa, but for the main balance between governments and, has been destroyed. So it's an enormous challenge. Thank you for your reminder.